When we think about climate change, often the first things that come to mind are, melting ice caps, maybe polar bears. And those are definitely powerful images.
They really are absolutely central to the story.
But what if the warming planet is doing more, acting almost like this silent force that's actually reshaping global power, global politics in ways we don't always see?
That's exactly it. It's fascinating and honestly pretty unsettling too. Today, we're doing a deep dive into exactly that, this complex web connecting climate change, geopolitics, and importantly, human migration.
Okay.
We'll be digging into how a changing climate isn't just an environmental issue, but it's actively skewing things like national security, economic plans, even how countries form alliances. And, of course, the massive movement of people. We've got some great articles guiding us here.
Right. So our mission really is to unpack that picture. We want to understand how things like rising temperatures, weird weather patterns, sea level rise, how these are becoming real levers on the world stage.
Levers, yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Influencing not just ecosystems, but the balance between nations and the lives of so many people. We're trying to look beyond the ice caps, really, to see the impact on borders, on tensions, and the human stories behind it all.
And it's worth remembering, climate shifts have always played a role in history. You can look back at ancient civilizations like the Akkadian Empire and drought, or even Europe's little ice age and the social upheaval it caused.
Sure, it's not entirely new.
Not entirely, and this is the crucial difference, the speed and the scale of what's happening now, that's unprecedented, largely, driven by the Industrial Revolution onwards.
Okay, let's break that down a bit. Geopolitics, that's basically how geography affects power between countries, right?
Fundamentally, yes. Territory, resources, location.
So how is climate change becoming a key geographical factor now? And maybe just to be clear, what do we mean by climate migration and environmental refugees? Are they the same thing?
Good question. So yeah, traditional geopolitics looked at those fixed things. Now climate change is actively reshaping the geography that matters. Coastlines changing, arable land shrinking, new routes opening up. It's a dynamic force.
Right.
And climate migration. That refers to people moving primarily because climate factors like, say, persistent drought or sea level rise have made their home area basically unlivable or unsustainable. Now, environmental refugee, you hear that term a lot, but it's actually tricky. Legally speaking, under the main international agreement, the 1951 Refugee Convention, there isn't a formal category for environmental refugee.
So they don't have the same legal protections.
Exactly. The definition is based on persecution, specific grounds like race, religion, politics. Environmental disaster doesn't neatly fit, which creates this huge gap in protection for people displaced by climate impacts. It's a major challenge.
Right, I see. So thinking about power shifts and conflicts, we hear this term threat multiplier used a lot with climate change, particularly by defense departments. What does that actually mean on the ground?
Yeah, that's a really key concept. What's interesting and quite worrying is that climate change itself rarely, if ever, directly causes a war.
Right.
Instead, think of it as something that amps up existing problems. It takes existing vulnerabilities, maybe water scarcity, ethnic tensions, poor governance, and it just makes them worse. It multiplies the threat.
Can you give an example?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Syria, between 2006 and 2011, experienced just this devastating drought, reportedly the worst in their modern history. It absolutely hammered agriculture, which was the livelihood for a huge chunk of the population. And this forced estimates are over 1.5 million people. 1.5 million people. Yeah, a massive internal migration from the countryside into cities that were already struggling, already overcrowded.
You can just imagine the pressure cooker effect that would have.
Precisely. It put immense strain on water, food, housing, jobs, everything. And this environmental stress, layered on top of existing political grievances and social tensions, is widely seen as a contributing factor, a significant one to the unrest that eventually spiraled into the Civil War.
So the drought wasn't the cause, but it was like pouring gasoline on a fire that was already smoldering.
That's a very good analogy. It acted as an accelerant, pushing a tense situation over the edge, a stark example of that threat multiplier effect.
And it's not just drought, right? You mentioned new routes opening up. The Arctic seems to be another place where climate change is really changing the geopolitical game.
Oh, massively. The Arctic is rapidly transforming into a major geopolitical hotspot. As that sea ice melts, and it's melting fast, shipping routes that were once just theoretical, like the Northern Sea route along Russia's coast,
Right.
are becoming navigable for longer periods. And this route potentially could cut the journey time between Asia and Europe by, well, some estimates say up to 40%.
40%? Wow, that's huge. That changes global trade dynamics completely.
Completely. A massive potential shift. And it's not just shipping.
Resources, too.
Exactly. Oil, gas, minerals, resources that were previously locked away under the ice are becoming accessible. So naturally, you're seeing increased interest, increased activity, and competing claims from the Arctic nations, Russia, the U.S., Canada, Norway, Denmark.
And even countries further afield, right. I hear China's very interested.
Very interested. China calls itself a near-Arctic state. So yes, you have non-Arctic states like China also wanting a piece of the action, focusing on resource access and scientific research. All this leads to, inevitably, more military patrols, new bases, more strategic posturing. The Arctic's becoming a busy place.
So melting ice isn't just an environmental story. It's literally redrawing the map of strategic competition.
It really is a new frontier, with all the tensions that implies.
Okay, so we have nations competing in newly opened areas. But let's swing back to the human side, the migration aspect. You mentioned that Syria example, but the potential scale globally sounds enormous. What was that figure again?
The World Bank projection, often cited by the IOM, is up to 216 million people potentially displaced internally within their own countries by 2050 due to slow onset climate impacts.
216 million. That's hard to even comprehend. Where are the biggest hotspots for this?
Well, several regions are particularly vulnerable. Sub-Saharan Africa is a major one. You've got desertification expanding, rainfall becoming much more erratic, hitting agriculture hard. This forces communities, often pastoralists or farmers, to move.
And South Asia. We hear a lot about Bangladesh, for example.
Yes, South Asia is critical. Low-lying, densely populated coastal areas in countries like Bangladesh, India, Vietnam. They're facing serious threats from sea level rise and increased storm surges. Millions live in these vulnerable zones.
And the Pacific Islands. Some seem like they're facing an existential threat.
They really are. For nations like Tuvalu, Kiribati, the Marshall Islands, rising seas aren't just a problem, they threaten the very existence of the entire country.
Yeah.
We're talking about potential complete submersion. It's an unimaginable prospect.
Truly. And when people are forced to move, internally or across borders, where do they typically end up? You mentioned cities earlier in the Syria context.
Overwhelmingly, yes. The trend is towards urban centers. People often move to the nearest town or city, hoping for work, for safety, for basic services.
But that must put incredible strain on those cities.
Incredible strain. Many cities, especially in developing nations, are already struggling with inadequate infrastructure, housing, sanitation, healthcare, schools. Adding large numbers of climate migrants, who often arrive with very little, just intensifies those pressures hugely.
Leading to?
Well, you often see increased poverty, slums expanding, more competition for scarce resources like water and jobs. This can unfortunately fuel social tensions, sometimes along ethnic lines, increase crime, and even contribute to political instability within those cities.
You mentioned Dhaka, Bangladesh, as a case study earlier. What makes it such a stark example?
Dhaka is one of the fastest growing megacities in the world, and a huge part of that growth is driven by people moving from coastal and rural areas of Bangladesh that are being hit hard by river erosion, flooding, salinity intrusion, all linked to climate change.
So the city's booming, but struggling to cope.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It faces immense challenges. Chronic housing shortages, overwhelmed sanitation systems, severe traffic congestion, air and water pollution. And the constant influx of climate migrants just exacerbates all these problems, making sustainable development incredibly difficult.
It sounds like a cycle of vulnerability. And looping back to the legal side, this lack of recognition for climate refugees, that must leave people incredibly vulnerable.
It absolutely does. Because they don't fit the 1951 Convention's definition, they often fall through the cracks of international protection systems. They might not have the right to asylum, limited access to humanitarian aid compared to recognized refugees, and face deportation back to the very places they fled. It's a massive humanitarian gap.
So climate change drives displacement, puts pressure on cities, and you also mentioned it fuels competition for resources, the idea of resource wars.
Yes, that's another critical dimension. As climate change impacts things like rainfall patterns and glacier melt, vital resources like fresh water become scarcer or more unreliable in many regions. The same goes for arable land due to desertification or soil degradation, and fish stocks as oceans warm and acidify.
And when resources become scarce.
Competition intensifies. We're already seeing increased friction over shared water resources. Think about the tensions between India and China over the Brahmaputra River, which is vital for both.
Right, originating in the Himalayas.
Exactly. Or the long-running dispute involving Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam on the Blue Nile. Water is absolutely critical for these nations, and changes in flow due to climate change or upstream actions can become major points of conflict.
These are already complex geopolitical flashpoints, and climate change just adds another layer of stress.
A very dangerous layer. And the scarcity can also feed into something called environmental nationalism.
Environmental nationalism. What's that?
It's basically where countries start prioritizing their own resource security above all else, sometimes at the expense of international cooperation. Think nations imposing export bans on food during a drought to protect their own supply.
Hoarding resources, essentially.
In a way, yes. Or heavily investing in things like domestic renewable energy, not just for green reasons, but for strategic independence to reduce reliance on global energy markets. It can also manifest as resistance to international climate agreements perceived as limiting national economic options.
Right. It reminds me of that quote from Dr. Parag Khanna you mentioned about how climate change is shifting power away from just oil and gas towards control over water, rare earths for green tech, things like that.
Precisely. It highlights how the very definition of strategic resources is evolving. In the 21st century, access to reliable fresh water, the minerals needed for batteries and wind turbines, and control over green technology supply chains, these are becoming central to geopolitical power and competition.
So given all this, the security risks, the migration, the resource competition, what's happening on the global policy front, are things like the Paris Agreement actually making a difference?
Well, international agreements like the Paris Agreement are incredibly important. They provide the framework, the goals, like limiting warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius. And subsequent meetings like COP28 focus on hammering out the details, like finance for adaptation and this concept of loss and damage for vulnerable nations.
But are they working?
That's the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it? The framework is there, but implementation. That's where the challenges really lie. Meeting the emissions reduction targets is proving incredibly difficult for many countries.
And what about the money side? Climate financed the promise from rich countries to help poorer ones.
Ah, yes, the $100 billion a year pledge. That's been a major point of contention. Firstly, the target was met late, and there are ongoing debates about how the money is counted, whether it's loans or grants, and if it's truly additional funding.
So frustration from developing countries.
Huge frustration. Developing nations argue, quite rightly, that they've contributed least to the historical emissions causing the problem, yet they're often suffering the worst impacts. They see the finance pledge as a matter of climate justice, and the shortfalls and delays really erode trust, which you absolutely need for global cooperation.
And beyond the big agreements, are we seeing other shifts? You mentioned things like climate clubs or green protectionism.
Yes, these are emerging trends. Climate clubs are basically groups of countries with similar high climate ambitions who might offer each other preferential trade terms, potentially penalizing countries outside the club with weaker policies.
Like carbon tariffs.
Exactly. The EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism is a prime example, essentially a tariff on imports based on their carbon footprint. It's intended to prevent industries from just moving production to places with laxer rules, but
it could look like protectionism to others.
Precisely. It's labeled green protectionism by some. These measures, carbon tariffs, environmental standards used as trade barriers, could definitely drive cleaner production, but they also risk sparking trade disputes and creating new economic blocks based on climate policy. It adds another layer of complexity to global diplomacy.
It really feels like the ground is shifting under our feet, geopolitically speaking. Looking forward then, amidst all these challenges, are there pathways forward? Any glimmers of hope or opportunity?
There are definitely things happening. On the technology front, you have ongoing innovation. Things like climate-smart agriculture techniques that boost yields but use less water, fewer fertilizers, maybe capture carbon in the soil. That's crucial for food security.
And early warning systems.
Yes, big improvements there too. Using AI, satellite data, getting better at predicting floods, droughts, storms, which gives communities more time to prepare and reduces losses. Then you have the more controversial area of geoengineering.
Right, things like solar radiation management. Very debated.
Very debated. Huge potential risks and governance challenges there, but innovation across the board is happening.
And it's not just about big tech solutions, right? What about communities on the ground?
Absolutely crucial. Civil society, NGOs, grassroots movements, and especially indigenous communities, they are often leading the way in practical adaptation and resilience building.
How so?
Well, think about community-led mangrove restoration projects in places like Southeast Asia. Mangroves are amazing coastal defenses against storm surges, and they support biodiversity. Or look at how traditional water-sharing agreements are being revived or adapted in parts of Africa to manage drought. Indigenous knowledge often holds really valuable, locally specific insights for adaptation.
So there is hope in adaptation, finding ways to live with the changes already happening.
Definitely. We have to adapt. That means investing in climate-resilient infrastructure, roads, buildings, water systems that can withstand impacts. It means better planning for migration, both internal and potentially cross-border, to manage it proactively rather than reactively. And integrated water resource management is key. Adaptation is not a substitute for cutting emissions, but it's absolutely essential.
Of course, we should acknowledge the counterarguments, too. Some say, look, political instability or bad governance is the real root cause of conflict or migration, not climate change itself.
And that's a fair point to raise. Climate change doesn't happen in a vacuum. Pre-existing political fragility, weak institutions, economic inequality, these are definitely massive factors.
So climate isn't the sole driver.
Rarely, if ever, the sole driver. But the strong consensus among security analysts and climate scientists is that climate change acts as that potent stressor, that threat multiplier we talked about. It interacts with and worsens those existing problems. It pushes fragile situations towards crisis. So while governance matters hugely, ignoring the amplifying role of climate change would be a mistake.
And tracking who's a climate migrant must be incredibly difficult, right? People move for lots of reasons.
Incredibly difficult. There's no passport stamp for climate migrant. Decisions to move are almost always complex, a mix of economic hardship, lack of opportunity, maybe conflict, and environmental degradation. Disentangling those threads is tough. Plus, the lack of a standard international definition we discussed makes collecting reliable, comparable data a huge challenge.
Okay. So pulling this all together, it seems clear climate change is way more than just an environmental issue. It's a fundamental geopolitical force, a driver of human movement on a vast scale. It's a human drama.
That sums it up perfectly. It's forcing nations to rethink everything: borders, alliances, security doctrines, and it's causing immense suffering and displacement, driven not by armies, but by a changing planet. Addressing these consequences isn't just about the environment. It's fundamental for peace, for stability, and frankly, for human dignity.
It really hammers home the need for, well, collective action, not just cutting emissions drastically, which is paramount, but also seriously investing in adaptation, preparing for impacts, and supporting the most vulnerable people and places caught in the crosshairs.
Absolutely. It requires a massive coordinated effort. Governments, international organizations, businesses, communities, individuals, everyone has a role to play.
This has been incredibly insightful, really painting a picture of how interconnected everything is. Thank you for walking us through that complex landscape.
My pleasure. It's crucial stuff to grapple with.
And for you, our listener, as you think about all this, maybe consider how these bigger geopolitical shifts, driven by climate, might eventually ripple down and affect daily life in unexpected ways, even far from the front lines of climate impact.
That's a sobering thought.
Or, here's another angle. Does the sheer scale of potential climate displacement mean we need to fundamentally rethink ideas about national borders and sovereignty? Does that concept even hold up in the face of millions needing refuge from environmental collapse?
Deep questions. And if you want to explore further, the sources we looked at raise other key points. How can international law evolve to actually protect climate migrants? What role could AI play, not just in prediction, but maybe in managing adaptation or migration flows? And crucially, how can we better incorporate the wisdom of indigenous knowledge systems into our adaptation strategies?
Lots to think about as we navigate what's clearly a planet in flux. Thanks again for joining us for this deep dive.